Hello and welcome to Avalara's latest e-invoicing webinar on European e-invoicing updates 2023. What's new and what's next? I'm Alex Borf, Senior Director for Global Indirect Tax and e-invoicing. My background is I have over 18 years experience within global indirect tax, VAT, GST, sales tax, as well as tax technology and e-invoicing. I've got experience on large transformation projects, working for Deloitte and Grant Thornton. And at Avalara, my role is to track big catalyst events within the world of global indirect tax. And of course, the biggest trend and catalyst at the moment is the shift towards e-invoicing and live reporting. I'm also the head of product for Avalara e-invoicing. I'm a member of the European Commission's e-invoicing advisory group. And recently I've been elected as a board member of the US's new Digital Business Networks Alliance. I represent Avalara within Open Peppol and ESPA, the European E-Invoicing Service Provider Association. So very quickly, if you don't know about Avalara already, I'm going to provide a bit of background to the company. We were founded in 2004 in the US out of Seattle, but today very much a global tax technology company. We've been disrupting the status quo of global tax management by providing fast, easy, accurate ways to manage transactional taxes, so indirect tax. We help our customers achieve compliance, reduce risk, and streamline their processes. We have over 1,200 different partner integrations, so into different business systems, and we have over 30,000 customers worldwide. We truly are a global company with our EMEA headquarters in Brighton in the UK, but offices across Europe, in France, Germany, Spain, Romania, Belgium, Luxembourg, Turkey, and many more. We also have large operations in India and Brazil. Avalara has a range of SaaS solutions across the entire indirect tax lifecycle. So all the way from obtaining registrations for sales tax, GST, VAT, and IPT, as well as obtaining a Peppol registration to use the Peppol network. We have solutions to help classify goods for duty and import VAT. We also have a tax calculation engine, so helping with determination. And we're probably most famous for this. Our Avalara solution that supports sales tax, VAT, GST, as well as duty. And in 2021, we had over 33.9 billion calls to the API. We are also have solutions for e-invoicing following our acquisition of Imposia 2 years ago. Avalara e-invoicing and live reporting supports e-invoicing in around 60 different countries across different business segments, B2B, public procurement for B2G, as well as B2C e-reporting. And that supports different models of e-invoicing from clearance. We can generate QR codes, we can create PDFs, and we can connect to various networks, private and public, including the Peppol network. And then finally, at the end of the indirect tax compliance lifecycle, we also have solutions for returns and reporting. Our SaaS VAT reporting solution, as well as a managed version. And Avalara processed and filed more than 4.1 million returns in 2021. So what's on today's agenda for this webinar? Well, I'm going to start by looking at the mandate timeline, what's happened around the globe and within Europe over the last decade, what's happened last year, this year, and looking ahead to 2024, which is a very pivotal year. We're then going to do a very quick round robin across certain individual European countries. So we're going to be looking at France, Spain, Poland, Romania, Serbia, Benelux, Belgium and Luxembourg, Germany, and then finishing up with a very quick summary of VEDA, VAT in the digital age, the next steps, some key dates, as well as sharing some initial feedback. So I wanted to look at the timeline, what we've seen over the last decade within the world of global e-invoicing and what's coming up over the next 5 years. So this webinar is very much focused on Europe and double clicking into some certain EU member states, what's happening this year, next year, over the next 18 months. But I think it's important to put this into context. So e-invoicing, particularly in Latin America, South America, isn't new. It's part and parcel of daily business life. And Brazil was the first country to implement e-invoicing, over 10 years ago. And since then, most countries in the region have implemented e-invoicing. Different models, not much interoperability between countries, and no real mechanism for cross-border between those Latin American countries. Where we've seen e-invoicing mandates or adoption within Europe, it's tended to be more around public procurement, so business to government mandates, or we've seen new forms of digital reporting, additional supplementary returns, supplementary to the VAT return, to give the tax authorities sight of individual transactions. And Italy was the first country to actually mandate business-to-business e-invoicing. They did that in 2019 with their new STI platform. But really what we've seen over the last couple of years is, well, two things. One, more and more regulations around e-invoicing in Europe, more countries mandating business to government, as well as more proposals, pilots, and platforms being developed to support mandatory e-invoicing. This year, in 2023, Serbia became the next European country to mandate general business-to-business e-invoicing. That was from January this year. And we started to see countries across APAC do the same. Not always tax-driven. And in fact, the European angle and link here is countries like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, possibly even Malaysia coming up later this year, are all looking to leverage the Peppol network. Peppol was set up within Europe as part of a European Commission project to support the digitalization of public procurement. But Peppol now is very much a global network, a global standard. And the great thing here is leading to interoperability between two different continents. So a business in Europe can raise an invoice to a customer in Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and they can receive it. There's common formats that are known and can be exchanged. But next year is the really big transformational year. It really is the big bang for e-invoicing within Europe. And obviously that's going to be a lot of the focus of this webinar, providing updates about France, about Spain, about Poland, and other member states are hot on their heels. There's been announcements, proposals, pilots in relation to Belgium, Romania, Slovakia, of course, all subject to receiving derogations from the European Commission. But the need for a derogation may soon disappear, because in December last year, we had VEDA, VAT in the Digital Age, a long-awaited proposal to amend the VAT directive and some other pieces of key VAT legislation to, in effect, remove the barriers to individual businesses and EU member states from implementing mandatory e-invoicing, to provide greater harmonization standards to govern those rollouts. And the big announcement is currently slated for January 2028 is the rollout of mandatory e-invoicing to underpin live reporting at the time of the transaction or within 2 days for all intra-community EU supplies of goods and services. But what I'd say is, that isn't the starting gun. That's the finishing line. The starting gun has begun. It's gone off. We're going to see, over 45% of European GDP covered by an e-invoicing mandate by next year. And really between now and 2028, other EU member states will implement mandatory e-invoicing. The vast majority of countries already have draft plans or proposals or are working on platforms. So do start preparing now. There are various different models for e-invoicing. Unfortunately, there isn't just one model that is prevalent across the globe. I've already mentioned Peppol. That's a great example of a four-corner model or an interoperability model. And that's based on service providers sitting in the middle, forming two corners of the four-corner model. They will ensure interoperability by ensuring the data, the invoice, meets a standard. And then they will share that through a secure network. Only those service providers have access keys. And the invoice is shared between two accredited providers and then passed back to the ultimate customer, the ultimate user. The great thing about this is there are no roaming fees. You're not forced to use the same service provider as your supplier, your vendor, or your customer. So this is moving away from the kind of legacy model of procurement networks, where maybe one business insisted or incentivized a business to use a particular service provider to join a particular procurement network. Another model is live reporting, live VAT reporting. So this isn't really e-invoicing, but it's a flavor of it. It's a subset of it. It's the reporting of invoice data or a subset of that invoice to the tax authorities in real time or close to real time. So a great example of this is Hungary with its real-time reporting regime. In Hungary, there isn't currently a mandate for e-invoicing. It often gets grouped as an e-invoicing mandate, but in Hungary, you can still raise an invoice in paper. You can still use a standard PDF. The data doesn't need to be structured. It doesn't need to be in XML. However, and this impacts all businesses, whether you are established in Hungary or not, when that invoice is issued, that invoice data needs to be reported within a predetermined schema as an XML to the Hungarian tax authority. So they're getting all of the transactional detail themselves, even though the customer, the counterparty, may not need to receive an e-invoice themselves. We then look at some of the common e-invoicing models that are being implemented, which in effect have continuous transaction controls. That's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but for me, it's not one single model. It covers a lot of different variants. So we have a clearance model where the tax authority actually wants to see the invoice. They want to see the invoice data before the supplier is allowed to issue that invoice and send it to the customer. So this has been the case in Brazil. And this is actually a very common model because tax authorities want to validate, they want to approve that invoice before it's sent. It also allows them to carry out checks on the authenticity of the issuer. Are they VAT registered? Are they who they say they are? And that's often supported by a digital signature, as well as ensuring the authenticity and integrity of the invoice content. So running various checks based on predefined formats, schemas, standards. And if the invoice fails any of those, it can be rejected. So that the business is, instructed, it will get an error message or a hard failure to say, you cannot send this to the customer. And it can take various forms. Sometimes a tax authority will sign the invoice. They may generate a QR code that goes on the invoice. They may provide a unique reference number, in effect, making that invoice legal and a valid tax invoice for VAT purposes. There are slight variations on this as well. So within that clearance model, under a centralized model, it's actually the tax authority, its platform, its portal that sends the invoice onto the counterparty, onto the customer. So no longer is a business function where the business actually exchanges the invoice direct with the customer. Instead, they will retrieve that from the government, from the tax authority. And this is how the SDI platform in Italy works, that first mandate that was implemented and is live now. And this is a great example of one of the changes next year because Poland and Poland's KSeF platform is a centralized model. So in Poland next year, every single invoice looks the same. There is a common XML to meet a Polish standard, the FA_VAT. However, it's the KSeF platform that then converts that XML into a human readable PDF. It's in Polish and everything looks the same. And the way that is obtained, retrieved by the customer is through them logging onto the platform, retrieving the PDF, downloading it, or using their e-invoicing service provider to automate the retrieval of that document. And then kind of future states, there is this idea of adding a fifth or sixth corner to the interoperability model, leveraging a network like Peppol, but putting the tax authority in the middle. So being able to have a clearance system, being able to have a tax authority receive live data from an invoice, but still having a model based on interoperability, common standards, and the service providers playing that key role to ensure that. So often perceived as a future state model, this is what Belgium may look to do, Sweden as well. Peppol is working with a number of tax authorities to explore the feasibility of this model. It is actually what the French model next year may look like itself, because I'm going to talk about this a bit later on. There is currently a Peppol proof of concept, a POC, to leverage the Peppol network and directory to connect the accredited providers in France, the PDPs. And I'm going to provide an update on that later. So jumping in straight away with France. France is a huge new mandate. It will impact over 4 million businesses next year. France is mandating mandatory B2B in e-invoicing from July 2024. There is already a mandate for business to government invoicing, so any invoicing to the state or other public departments. That uses its own platform, Chorus Pro. That Chorus Pro platform is being revamped, rebuilt to create a new PPF, a public portal that will be used as part of this new mandate. So the mandate covers the issue, the transmission and receipt of all B2B e-invoices in a mandated format. And actually, it's not just one format. There's going to be a choice of 3 core formats that are going to be supported by all providers and supported by the public portal. But actually, there's going to be scope for more industry-specific formats, more EDI, EDIFACT formats, which I'm going to talk about a bit later on. Businesses in France will have the choice to use an approved third party, so a commercial e-invoice service provider, or maybe a business platform which has that functionality. That's known as a partner dematerialization platform, or PDP. At the moment, all the service providers who have declared their interest are a candidate PDP. So Avalara is a candidate PDP through our subsidiary Imposia France. We're going through the candidate process. Everyone is in the same position, working together in various working groups with the French tax authorities. Smaller businesses are able to connect direct to the public invoicing portal, the PPF, the Portail Public de Facturation. But the French authorities have made it very clear this is really only designed for the smallest businesses in France, the local boulangerie, businesses that only have simple invoices, not many to issue and receive. It's been built to support them, more manual processes, but really not a scalable option for larger businesses. But the mandate itself doesn't just cover e-invoicing, it also covers e-reporting. And this is a common trend we're seeing across Europe when new mandates are announced. So as well as domestic B2B transactions within scope of e-invoicing, there needs to be e-reporting, so submission of a subset of the invoice data, certain mandatory fields, in a mandatory format of B2C sales within France, cross-border transactions, as well as payment data. And that payment data is key because in France, that helps drive the time of supply, the tax points for services. So just a bit of a recap very quickly in terms of the timeline. The headline, of course, is this is a phased approach. So only the largest enterprises in France need to be issuing e-invoices from the 1st of July. However, really that means every single business in France needs to be in a position to receive e-invoices, to be ready for this in the same time frame from July next year. And that's because, every business of any size will have large vendors. So if they're mandated to send an invoice, the counterparty, the customer, needs to be in a position to receive it, to interpret it, to post it, to pay it. The staggered approach then continues. So 6 months later, from January 25, the mandate to issue is extended to more SMEs. And you'll see on the screen now the qualifiers for their annual sales of less than 1.5 billion euros. And then there's some additional time and an additional 12 months for SMEs and very small enterprises, VSEs. And again, showing the criteria on the screen now in terms of employees and revenue. So how will e-invoicing platforms in France be used to issue and send and receive invoices? Well, French businesses will no longer be able to send invoices direct to customers. You can no longer print and post. You can no longer send standard PDFs on email. There needs to be involvement from either the public platform or private PDPs. The choice of platform to receive the invoice from suppliers, from different vendors, is the commercial choice and a decision to be taken by businesses. And as I said before, the French government are very keen to really emphasize that there's only core functionality within the public portal, and more value-added services, increased functionality, usability, that is better served by the private sector, by private platforms. And of course, service providers like Avalara, other candidate PDPs, this isn't our first rodeo. So, solutions aren't just being built for France. It's leveraging global scalable functionality, based on, user feedback, based on sales and procurement processes. So what formats can be used in France? Well, there are multiple acceptable formats. So to some extent, some choice and flexibility. Compare that to some other mandates where there's, no choice, very strict format, a local structure that needs to be met. All three formats are actually compliant implementations of the European e-invoicing standard, EN 16931. If you're not familiar with that standard, those numbers, you soon will be, because VEDA, VAT in the Digital Age, that European standard plays a really key role. It was developed for public procurement. If you remember, I talked about the real drive towards digitalizing public procurement over the last few years, and that led to B2G mandates in Europe. Well, that standard was created to ensure interoperability. That standard is now being leveraged for wider business-to-business use. So all partner platforms, the PDPs, will offer all three core formats, and that is Universal Business Language, UBL, the Cross-Industry Invoice, CII, and FactuX, which is a hybrid PDF A3. So the great thing about FactuX is the best of both worlds. It's machine readable because it's got embedded XML code, CII, but at the same time, it's readable, viewable to a human. So there are also some content changes within the mandate. So new fields need to be added to an invoice, and these need to be part of the structured data that is shared with the French tax authorities and with the customer. So the new content requirements include the delivery address for goods, where that's different from the customer's address that's shown on the invoice. The customer's serial number also needs to be shown on the invoice. That plays a really key role. And the narrative that the option for the payment of tax on the basis of debits, I'm not going to butcher the French, that needs to be shown where the supplier has opted to use the accrual basis. There are good technical documentation out. The latest version was recently released in English. I'm going to focus on that in a minute. There's very good, frequently asked questions, providing commentary on the mandate, the scope, and the impact. I said before, service providers are going through a PDP accreditation process with candidates at the moment. It's quite important to look at the PDP requirements because there is quite a high bar in France. So this has led to a lot of businesses to actually say, look, we cannot do this because the requirements are so strict. So a very formal certification process. Ultimately, that will lead to third-party audits, documentation that needs to be provided. There is a very strict cybersecurity requirement that's very unique to France. It's called the SecNum Cloud. And this is a French standard. And it's all about data integrity, sovereignty of data. And really, it's all about that data not being able to leave the European Union. So, a lot of the big data hosting companies, the big names, AWS, Google, other service providers are available. They aren't able to meet that requirement on their own. So we're going to start to see joint ventures with French customers, French service providers to meet those really strict requirements. And a PDP therefore needs to be able to meet those and have a SecNum Cloud compliance certificate. In addition, there is a requirement to have ISO 27001 certification. That's around security. This is becoming a theme around the world. So this will become a likely requirement for Peppol. It's already a requirement in Australia, Japan, and Singapore. There needs to be an audit report obtained from a third party. And, one of the key requirements, an illegal duty here is to actually update the annuaire. So the annuaire is the central directory of all French businesses, linking, with their tax ID number. And this will contain the information for e-invoicing, who the business is, their ID number, but also, are they using the public portal, or who is their PDP of choice on record? And that will allow the invoice to be routed to the correct counterparty. So very quickly, version 2.3 of the technical specs has recently been released. This was released at the end of April. It's now a whopping 142 pages, but very good, very clear, and some great diagrams. So, even if, you're going through an RFP process, maybe you haven't started planning yet, maybe, you're leaving a lot of the technical work to third parties, consultants, you're working with third-party e-invoice service providers, I would still recommend that you do read this documentation. It's good, it's clear, it's commercial, but it will also show you the impact to business processes, because this isn't just a compliance requirement to meet. This is really changing business as usual for procurement, for AP, for sales, for master data, for how you get paid, how you exchange invoices. The technology bit is the easy bit. The PDPs will handle that. There's very strict requirements. We've been working together, over a number of months, over a year. What needs to happen are the prerequisite steps, really reviewing the data within the systems. Where is that held? What's the quality? What's the granularity? Because today, if you're missing master data or certain pieces of transactional data, maybe there's just a risk. Maybe you're not meeting an invoicing standard. Maybe there's an impact to input tax recovery or a possible penalty. Within e-invoicing, if you're missing that data, the invoice will fail. It will be rejected. There are a number of controls that PDPs and the public platform will carry out. So the computer will actually say no from the get-go. So for me, businesses need to prepare, but it's not about a mad rush just to get the technology implemented, because the platform's still being built. The providers will have ability to start testing later this year, probably towards Q4. There's going to be a pilot from January. But really, implementations will be more next year. The implementation work is broader than the actual system integration. It's about the preparation. It's about stakeholder awareness, both internally and externally. And it's really about the data and the impact processes. So I briefly alluded to Peppol potentially being used in France. So this is a kind of separate initiative. You won't see this listed in the technical specifications. But there is a POC, and this involves, most of the candidate PDPs, so service providers, again, like Avalara, as well as ISPA and Peppol. And we're seeing if we can successfully use the Peppol directory, the SMP, to connect individual PDPs together using the Peppol network to exchange invoices. So exchanging those core formats, the UBL, the CII, the FactureX, as well as some extended profiles that may meet some industry standards, so like EDIFACT. So without this network, PDPs are actually expected to go out, sign in interoperability agreements between each other, and build connections with each other. That is already happening. We obviously work together with service providers. E-invoicing should be an open network. We need to work together. However, given the number of PDPs and the number of individual connections, that probably isn't scalable, particularly with the tight timeframes. So leveraging Peppol could be a very pragmatic way to support these core formats and some extended formats. There'll still be individual connections, one-on-one, between different service providers to support more niche formats, very specific use cases for specific French businesses or industries. But this proof of concept, which has started, we were actually involved in testing this week, sharing documents with other candidate PDPs. If this works, this is likely to be part of the circuit flow within France. And this is an example of a native interoperability model based on these principles of a decentralized CTC. So I won't go into too much detail. There is a lot of technical information in terms of the proposal, how this works, connecting to the annuaire, connecting to the Peppol directory, and using that Peppol network. But think of the network as a highway. It's building roads, it's building connections between the different PDPs. So invoices can flow and documentation can be exchanged. And just a very quick reminder of the next steps in France. So there is going to be a pilot next year from January, based on some limited participants, probably around 100. The application process has started. The deadline is in mid-June, so that is fast approaching. There'll be a kickoff meeting with candidate PDPs later this summer, for the ones successful to be in the pilots. Sometime between July and November, the tax authority will be finalizing the PPF. There's a lot of work that's going on, based on this new Chorus platform and migrating the legacy Chorus Pro. And there'll be more technical guidance on the individual workflows for status updates too. The PDP accreditation process has now started. So, businesses are working through the requirements and ultimately will be submitting applications. We'll start to see the fruits of that, towards later this year, maybe September. And then the pilot is for 6 months. And then that takes us to the start of the mandate, the 1st of July, 2024. So moving on to Spain, the other big EU economy that is currently slated to mandate e-invoicing next year. So the Spanish Gazette officially published the growth law, the law Cresa. My Spanish is as bad as my French. This mandates businesses in Spain and professionals to issue and receive e-invoices from 2024. This was originally likely to be January the 1st, 2024. It looks like this is going to be pushed back to at least July 2024. We're still awaiting the full technical requirements of the new e-invoicing regime. There's still some pieces of legislation to be approved, and this is very much subject to change. So we're certainly not in the same position as France, with the 140 pages of technical information, the different work groups, and all the legislation aligned. So there could be possible delays, but there could just also be changes to what a mandate means. Could it be more general e-invoicing, rather than a tax-led initiative? Could this be just leveraging the existing Spanish national e-invoicing networks and standards, the e-Factura, submitted on the FACE B2B network? Or, are we going to be meeting brand new technical requirements which are yet to be confirmed? So one of the areas of possible delays or change is due to a recent public consultation. So the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Digital Transformation in Spain issued a consultation back in March. This posed 32 questions, so very in-depth, looking at the scope. Is this right? What about the formats, and how do we cope with interoperability between service providers, between documents? What statuses do we need for this e-invoicing workflow? What about submission to the tax authorities? Other considerations, particularly for smaller businesses, and could there be a centralized option, a connection for smaller businesses too? So we're still awaiting the results. That public consultation ended on the 22nd of March. That feedback is likely to be used to reshape the e-invoicing mandate, provide the granularity that we need. This could, of course, lead to delays. There is a Spanish general election approaching as well. That could complicate things too, based on the party agendas. So again, very much watch this space. Be prepared. Be prepared to adopt e-invoicing in Spain, but still do monitor for changes and be agile. The other reason why this may be delayed is just the absence of technical information. So the documentation was expected to be released within 6 months after the passing of the law. So we were expecting these in April 2023. Just ahead of that deadline, it was confirmed that these weren't going to be released, that had been postponed. Again, this is very likely linked with the public consultation and giving time for that feedback to be reviewed, consolidated, and for that to influence the future direction. But it's still anticipated that these technical specs may be released later this year. So what do we have? Well, we have draft legislation on the VERI FACTU software requirements. So this is very much requirements for the service providers themselves. So it may be taking a leaf out of Portugal's book and how they regulate invoicing software. And so this puts legal obligations on software providers to be accredited, to meet very specific technical requirements, and to have authentication to be certified. So, top of the requirements, systems need to be able to generate a registration billing record at the time of the issue of the invoice or immediately prior to that. Need to add a fingerprint or a hash to the billing records. The inclusion of an alphanumeric identification code, inclusion of a QR code, and that QR code would be underpinned by very specific technical and functional specs. And the narrative VERI FACTU, where the system meets all of these requirements and is able to send the invoice data as an export to the AEAT, the Spanish tax authorities. At the moment, it looks like digital signatures will be required, but won't be mandatory where the documents can be sent to the tax authority. So, a digital signature, as I said before, is often used to prove the authenticity of the supplier and also the authenticity and integrity of the invoice data. So probably still best practice, but it appears that if you're using this certified software and it's called the export functionality to send the data direct to the tax authority, this may not be required. But this is very much subject to change. It's still very much subject to legislative approval. Avalara is monitoring this and preparing for when this is finalized. So moving on to Poland, I briefly mentioned Poland and the KSeF platform when I was looking at the timeline, looking ahead to 2024. Well, Poland is another country that is introducing mandatory e-invoicing from July 2024. So this was originally slated to start in January 24. It's recently been announced it's being pushed back by 6 months. There's been a transitional period, so the platform has been developed. It's actually live. It's being used for business to government. It's being used for B2B on a voluntary basis. It's actually possible to connect now. I've tested this. I've seen this, with our customers. And it's very exciting to see, seeing how these business processes will change in Poland. As I said before, every single invoice will look the same in Poland, a move away, from business as usual today. And the derogation has been received. So this has been greenlit. It's been rubber stamped by the European Commission. This will go ahead. So digging into the detail a little, it's an XML standard, but it's a local Polish XML. So FA_VAT is the standard. The version 2 of the standard has recently been updated and released. So this is now available from the Ministry of Finance, from the website. There are changes to not only the first iteration, but also from the draft of the second one that was issued for consultation. So, do review it. If you've started to implement Poland, do take a pause. There are changes. You may need to update mappings. You may need slightly different data to be compliant. This standard, the version 2, will be moved to production in KSeF from the 1st of September 2023. So this is the standard that you need to use going forward, but also to meet the mandate in July 2024. This is likely to replace JPK, the existing digital SAFT transactional data requirement. At the moment, we don't have a clear timeframe on this, but as this is adopted, as the tax authority get data through e-invoicing, there's likely to be a change of scope of the JPK and maybe ultimately its removal. So moving on to Romania. Romania has a e-Factura system. So this is a platform that the Romanians have developed. This was built to support mandatory B2G e-invoicing, with the ultimate aim to scale this for B2B use. There have been teething issues. This has been described by ISPA as probably one of the worst implementations of e-invoicing. The problem is a lot of the technical documentation that's been released doesn't necessarily match up to what happens in practice. Romania is still waiting for derogation from the European Union. So, there isn't a clear date for a mandate when this can apply to all businesses. However, Romania has actually mandated its use for high-risk goods. So high fiscal risk goods, if you deal within that area, technically you have to use this already. Once a derogation has been issued, the ANAF, the Romanian tax authorities, have said they will issue an order 30 days after any derogation, and that will be to establish the scope and to provide details of the full timeline. So providing details on how long businesses have to prepare. But a derogation would have to be approved. And in light of VEDA, it's possible that this new model may not be approved, because we're starting to look at does this meet the standards, the model as proposed under VEDA. So again, watch the space. If you do have a subsidiary in Romania, you still need to be prepared. We are working on a number of implementations for customers already who are already covered by existing B2G or high-risk good scopes. And just as a quick summary, again, it is an XML format, but a Romanian standard. So a CIUS for Romania. This does meet the European e-invoicing standard. And following the transmission of the invoice to the e-Factura platform, a unique identification number will be assigned, so added to that invoice. There is a number of validation checks, and I'm going to walk through some of those in a minute. Most of those not unique to Romania. I think it's a good example, it's a good case study I use to show that the checks that are carried out by tax authorities. But But it'll be interesting to see, does some of that change under a post-VEDA world? So what checks are carried out under e-Factura? Well, various different verification and validation checks, different procedures being run automatically. So checks on the structure and syntax, checks on that are more semantic or logical, checks on the authenticity of the issuer. So again, we're now looking at, how do you identify the supplier, through the use of digital signatures, the integrity of the invoice content. And the Romanian tax authority said, look, no VAT checks will be carried out initially. But the key word is initially, because they've made it clear that these checks will be added. And I think this is important because it shows the importance of real-time tax calculation, getting VAT right the first time at the point of sale. Really, under e-invoicing, there's no room for error because it's not like this may be picked up in the event of an order. You are suddenly sharing every single transaction, the tax you charged, and actually based on the European e-invoicing standard, maybe even an exemption code. You're showing why you're why you are charging tax at a certain rate, or why you're exempting. So with this improved visibility, this granularity of data, it really shows the importance of getting tax right first time. And it's possible, actually, like in Romania, there may be checks built in. And if the tax authority don't agree with that tax charged, maybe it's outside an acceptable range, it will be rejected. And the invoice won't have a unique number assigned, and you won't be able to issue that to the customer. So moving on to Serbia. Serbia mandated e-invoicing from January 2023, so earlier this year. Again, it has a e-Factura system, so a government platform. It is following European and global standards. So the document is based on UBL 2.1. If you don't know UBL, it's Universal Business Language. It is a global standard. It's really like a global data dictionary. Really the leading definition of different data fields and a common way of presenting this as an invoice, as a commercial document. And Avalara actually uses UBL for our API. This is how we receive data from ERPs, billing platforms, marketplaces, to then generate compliant e-invoices based on the country standards. So very scalable, and you'll start to see this rolled out in more and more countries. There is technically a local CS, so that stands for a core invoice usage specification. It's kind of the localization of the standard. But actually in Serbia, it's identical to the European standard. That may be linked to Serbia's status as a EU accession state. It wants to join the EU. So it's very much aligning its VAT legislation with the EU VAT directive, but also now aligning its e-invoicing standard with the European e-invoicing standard. What else to know in Serbia? Well, you do need to register on the electronic identification portal. You need a qualified electronic certificate or use two-factor authentication. So that's done via a mobile phone. The archiving in Serbia is a minimum of 10 years. 10 years is probably the average we're seeing now across Europe. E-invoice solution providers that carry out what's known as information intermediary activities, they must be approved, accredited by the Ministry of Finance. However, that said, it is possible for systems and businesses to connect direct to the e-Factura platform, rather than use some of the value-add services from an information intermediary. Moving on to Portugal, there aren't any mandatory B2B requirements at the moment. They're just in play for B2B, for public procurement in Portugal. However, there are very strict requirements that apply to e-invoicing and invoicing in general. And these now equally apply to non-resident Portuguese VAT-registered businesses. So if you're a UK, French, German, Australian company and you're registered for VAT in Portugal, you're actually caught by these requirements. So there's a requirement to use a certified invoice software provider. So that software will be accredited. It will have a unique identification code. You need to be able to produce a QR code and that to be printed on the invoice or receipt. And at the end of the period, you need to be able to generate an invoice SAFT, so a listing of all the invoices issued from that certified billing software. And from that software, generate this file and submit that to the Portuguese tax authorities. There's also a unique document number that identifies that specific tax invoice and confirms their validity within Portugal. And that's the ATCUD code, the ATCUD. So loads and loads of different requirements, all interlinked, but equally applying to non-residents. So even though in Portugal you can still raise a standard PDF invoice, even though you can still use paper, there are strict requirements around invoicing, and businesses need to be aware of them and become compliant. But talking about standard PDFs, from January next year, this requirement keeps getting pushed back. If you are doing e-invoicing, but you're using a non-EDI method, so you're using a standard PDF, for example, that needs to be digitally signed. So you need to use what is known as a qualified electronic signature. Add that to the PDF to make it valid as an official e-invoice under the tax legislation. Moving on to Slovakia. Slovakia is another Central Eastern European country that is developing its own e-invoicing platform, paving the way for mandates, primarily built to meet business to government supplies, but again being scaled for future B2B use. So Slovakian businesses will be able to connect to this platform via their ERPs, through an open API web service. And if any non-resident businesses need to use this, for example, for B2G, they'll be able to send and receive invoices to and from Slovakian public bodies via a dedicated email address. So the timeline on this is still quite fluid. Government entities have had access to a test environment from April this year, and the mandates will follow. But again, very much subject to a derogation from the European Commission. Moving on to Benelux, so Luxembourg and Belgium. These are two countries that have recently introduced mandatory business-to-government e-invoicing. So if you are involved in public procurement in these two countries, there's been a phased approach. So luckily, this is based on the European e-invoicing standard, UBL, and you can use Peppol. But the way they've been implemented is slightly different. So in Luxembourg, it's based on the size of the company. Phase 1 for large businesses last year in May, moving to phase 2 medium in October. And then recently, in the last few months, that's now capturing all businesses. So the smallest businesses in Luxembourg, when they do business with the state, a public authority, the invoice needs to be issued electronically. So, using Peppol. Belgium has also implemented this on a very similar timeline, but it's actually based on the value of the size of the contract under public procurement. So phase 1, invoices with a value of 214,000 euros. That value has been decreased to only 30,000 euros as a phase 2 in May this year. But then that is then scaled to all contracts, so even contracts below 30,000 euros, and that's from November 2023. So not long to prepare for that. But as I said, Peppol can be used to meet this requirement using a common standard and a common network, joining about 750,000 businesses that are already on the network. That's likely to scale to about 1 million later this year. And then staying in Belgium, there's been a lot of news reported that Belgium is likely to go for mandatory B2B e-invoicing. It's been confirmed via various budgetary notes in Belgium by the Minister of Finance. What do we know? Well, it's been rumoured that this could come in as early as 2024, so next year. However, we're still at an early stage. We still need legislation. We still need full technical requirements. And again, there needs to be a derogation from the European Commission. However, that said, what we understand is Belgium will actually use the Peppol network. It will become the first EU member state to use the Peppol network for mandatory B2B e-invoicing. There's already a very large adoption of Peppol in Belgium. And this, avoids the Belgian government having to build its own separate infrastructure. It's really leveraging something that's tried, proven, tested, and trusted. And, if you joined a previous webinar with Avalara, when we had a guest speaker from the Australian Tax Office, we heard the same sentiments. That's why Australia decided to adopt Peppol, building on global international standards, something that was proven, something with the infrastructure in place. So, if businesses are prepared for B2G and they're already connected to Peppol, they have a certified service provider like Avalara, that actually hopefully puts them in a very good position for when this B2B mandate is defined and we have the time frame. So then finally looking at Germany. So Germany, of course, a huge economy in Europe, really the industrial heartbeat. Well, on the eve of VEDA, so ahead of the launch of VEDA in December, Germany actually announced that it had submitted a request for a derogation to the European Commission to introduce mandatory B2B e-invoicing domestically within Germany for German-to-German businesses. But the clever thing here is, because Germany had already been involved in the discussions, debate, design of VEDA, the request for a derogation is based on VEDA compliance. So based on the European e-invoicing standard and based on the other principles set out in VEDA. So, it's likely that this has a very good chance of being approved. At the time, Germany said, look, we don't have a clear time frame. We've got a consensus to implement B2B e-invoicing on a mandatory basis. We just don't have the political consensus to define when that will be. So the big announcement, the recent news, is the BMF has released a highly anticipated draft paper. So it's a paper for discussion on the introduction of mandatory e-invoicing. So this sets out, further details. Again, talking about the scope, it's domestic, looking at the European e-invoicing standard, confirming it will be compliant with VEDA. But the date set out here is January 2025. So, we have this draft date, and there's still a long way to go in terms of approvals, legislation, as well as technical specifications, understanding what infrastructure will be used. But because this is such a key country, it should be on everyone's radar if you do business within Germany. So that marks the end of my kind of round robin around Europe in terms of providing updates for this year and next. What I wanted to do quickly was just provide a very quick update on VEDA, Out in the Digital Age. I have been mentioning this as we've gone along. I don't intend to go into too much detail on this. We do have webinars on demand that you can access with further information. But within e-invoicing and digital reporting, there are some big changes. So today, the definition of an e-invoice can include PDFs, so unstructured data. Under VEDA, a standard PDF is no longer acceptable. It would need to have structured data. So a simple PDF no longer qualifies. You'd have to use a PDF A3. Like in France, the Factor X. In Germany, the Zugford. This is also going out of region now, but this is also what is being used in Saudi Arabia as a human readable version. At the moment, we also have the concept of buyer consent under the VAT directive. So, if a business wants to adopt e-invoicing voluntary and send an e-invoice the customer, the buyer, needs to agree to that. And that's to ensure that, they're not put in a position where they have to invest in software. They can't be forced to use a procurement network against their will. So that is likely to be removed. Buyer consent will no longer be needed. So again, removing the barriers to allow businesses to adopt e-invoicing more freely. At the moment, EU member states need a derogation. We've talked about that. That's been the big caveat as we looked at a lot of these proposed e-invoicing regimes. It's been proposed that derogation requirement will disappear, but instead, the mandate that will be underpinned by a request would need to meet the e-invoicing standards as per VEDA. So there'd be a clear set of guidelines, and therefore permission would not be required. At the moment, we have pre-clearance models, current planned. I said Italy was a great example of this, the SDI. Technically under VEDA, pre-clearance models are prohibited. In a minute, I'm just going to provide a bit of feedback on that. There's a lot of discussion, debate on what does that actually mean, because there's a very fine line between validating an invoice in terms of the content, other rules, and actually clearing the invoice before it's sent to the customer. At the moment, we have fragmented standards and requirements across Europe. This applies not only to e-invoicing, but to digital reporting. Member states have created their own digital reporting requirements. To the detriment of business, it's very difficult to invest in a single scalable process. So under VEDA, e-invoicing will have to meet a common standard, scaling EN 16391, the European e-invoicing standard. At the moment, paper and e-invoices have parity. Now, as I said, businesses have the choice and the buyer has to agree to receive an e-invoice. But under VEDA, at least for intra-community supplies, there will no longer be the option to have a PDF or paper. It will be a mandated e-invoice. And that mandated e-invoice will underpin real-time digital reporting, live reporting of all intra-community transactions, replacing today's EC sales lists. And the VISE system that's currently used today, that will be replaced by a new, improved SuperVISE. So very quickly, the next steps, well, we're still receiving feedback, some more formal, some more anecdotal. Appears to be broad consensus on the digital reporting system, and that this needs to be underpinned by e-invoicing. There's still some questioning on timelines. Are these too optimistic? Are they realistic? Could there be some movement there? Some member states appear to still be in favor of a clearance system. But again, I think a lot of work needs to be done in really defining, what that looks like. So some key dates. Well, this was adopted by the European Commission on the 8th of December last year. Negotiation in Council is starting now. So the 16th of June was the date for that negotiation. There's been a positive opinion received from the European Data Protection Supervisor. So you can read a summary or the full report. There are some clear recommendations. So there is still some work to be done. But I don't think any real blocker here. There's been an opinion from the European Economic and Social Committee that's available. But then the next big date, after the negotiation in Council between the individual member states, is we're going to receive an official formal opinion of the European Parliament. So look out for that, the 1st of November 2023, later this year. And then, we're going to start to receive national parliament opinions on VEDA, in particular on proportionality. So we're starting to see some feedback, some formal statements released by governments. Expect many more. And of course, a lot of this will be underpinned by wider stakeholder events, providing more forums for feedback, but also providing regular updates on what's happening and what the likely changes will be. So there has been a public consultation. I wanted to share a few thoughts, concerns with industry. One of those is, at the moment, VEDA is very much focused on VAT. Of course it is. But an invoice plays a much wider role in different processes and different areas for different purposes. It is a request for payment. It has clear commercial and legal information that's provided, formal notifications. It's the foundation for most forms of supply chain finance, but it's also very critical in other areas of commercial law, but also customs. So, we're starting to look at, are additional fields needed? Is the European e-invoicing standard EN 16931 fit for purpose? Does need to change, evolve, adapt for wider business-to-business use. Remember, it had its birth within public procurement. So, do we need to change that? And look, to compare to KSeF, there's actually between 600 and 1,000 different data fields within that KSeF e-invoice. So I think there's going to be a lot of work, and it started already to update that standard, but also look at, are some things being missed? Is this going to have a negative impact on wider commercial and legal functions? Some feedback as well is around attachments. Do the attachments, those documents need to be in structured format? How will those be embedded? Do they need to be embedded? How will those be interpreted, processed by the counterparty? There are also some views that countries will rush to implement e-invoicing now. Now there's the finishing line of 28 for intra-community. By moving the derogation requirement, member states will just rush ahead and implement without time for meaningful consultation with stakeholders, and as well as not providing businesses with enough time to understand the requirements and implement. So someone has mentioned, maybe take some inspiration from the quick reaction mechanism. Can we create a notification requirement? So there's not a requirement to seek permission, but maybe there needs to be kind of minimum notice period, giving notice to the market, to business, that this is happening. And then finally, what is pre-clearance? There is a very fine line between controls, validation, and approval. A lot of those checks, tests that are carried out by platforms, look at my slide from Romania. There's a lot there, but a lot of that is to govern the standards, the format, to ensure interoperability. So those documents can still be processed and interpreted and posted by the counterparty. So, probably a bit of work that needs to be done there too. So that wraps up the end of this European e-invoicing update for 2023. I hope you found it informative, interesting, and hopefully, shared some new information with you. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much. And I hope to join you on a webinar soon. Thank you.